The afternoon sun bore down mercilessly on the presidential compound in Ouagadougou, turning the parade grounds into a shimmering mirage of heat. Ibrahim Traoré stood at his office window, hands clasped behind his back, watching his security detail conduct their routine exercises. At 36, he had become accustomed to the weight of leadership, but some burdens never grew lighter. His assistant, Major Karim Ouedraogo, knocked twice before entering. The military protocol remained even in private settings, a reminder that Burkina Faso's government still operated under martial order, a necessity born from years of insurgent attacks and political instability. "Captain President," Karim began, using the title Traoré preferred over more grandiose alternatives, "we have a situation that requires your immediate attention." Traoré turned from the window, his red beret casting a shadow across his angular features. "What kind of situation?" "Two men arrived at the gates this morning, both claiming to have served with you in Djibo during the Otapuanu offensive. Both are requesting an audience. Both insist they have critical information about potential threats to your government." Traoré's jaw tightened. Djibo. The name alone conjured memories of sand-filled trenches, the crack of rifle fire, and the faces of men who never made it home. The Otapuanu offensive had been brutal, a turning point in his military career and in his understanding of how poorly equipped his soldiers were while politicians enriched themselves. "That operation was 6 years ago," Traoré said carefully. "Many men served there. Why is this unusual?" Karim shifted his weight, clearly uncomfortable. "Sir, they're both claiming to be the same person. Lieutenant Moussa Diallo." The room seemed to contract around Traoré. Moussa Diallo. He remembered the name, remembered the man. A fellow officer who had fought beside him in some of the darkest hours of that campaign. They had shared rations, shared watch duties, shared the unspoken bond of men who had survived what others had not. "That's impossible," Traoré said, though his voice lacked conviction. "Have you verified their identities?" "We've tried, sir. Both men have military identification, though the documents appear to be from different periods. Both know details about the offensive that weren't made public. Both can describe the compound at Djibo, the commanders, even specific events from that time." Traoré moved to his desk, a simple wooden affair that stood in stark contrast to the ornate furnishings his predecessors had favored. He had insisted on modesty in all things, a reflection of his commitment to ending the corruption that had plagued Burkina Faso for decades. Where are they now? Separated, in different holding areas. "We thought it best to keep them apart until you could interview them personally." "You thought correctly." Traoré sat down, his mind racing through possibilities. An impostor, this sophisticated suggested resources, planning, and purpose beyond simple fraud. This could be an intelligence operation, someone trying to get close to me, to gather information or worse. "That was our assessment as well," Karim agreed. "Tab, there's another possibility. What if one of them genuinely is Diallo, and he's come to warn you about something? The insurgents have operatives everywhere. They could have captured the real Diallo, extracted information from him, and sent someone in his place." The implications were staggering. If insurgent groups had infiltrated his inner circle to this degree, no one could be trusted. Traoré thought of his closest advisors, the men and women he had brought into government after the coup. How many of them had he verified personally? How many had simply shown up with the right credentials and the right words? "I want both men brought to the interrogation facility," Traoré ordered. "Not here at the compound. Somewhere secure. And Karim, no one else knows about this." "Not yet." "Understood, sir." After Karim left, Traoré allowed himself a moment of reflection. He pulled open his desk drawer and removed a worn photograph, its edges frayed from years of handling. The image showed a group of soldiers posed in front of a military transport truck, their faces young and determined, despite the exhaustion evident in their eyes. Traoré stood in the center, and to his right was Moussa Diallo, a stocky man with a broad smile that seemed incongruous with the weapon slung over his shoulder. That photograph had been taken 2 days before the main assault on the insurgent positions. Traoré studied Diallo's face, trying to commit every detail to memory: the shape of his nose, the set of his eyes, the small scar above his left eyebrow where shrapnel had grazed him during an earlier engagement. Could he still recognize the real Moussa Diallo after 6 years? People changed. War changed them faster than anything else, And if someone had gone to the trouble of creating this deception, they would have done their research. They would know about the scar, about the smile, about every detail that might give them away. The sun had shifted lower in the sky when Traoré finally left his office. He changed into civilian clothes, a simple cotton shirt and trousers that would have been unremarkable in any market in Ouagadougou. The presidential convoy would draw too much attention. Instead, he took an unmarked vehicle with Karim driving and 2 trusted guards in a follow car. They drove through the city as evening settled over the capital. Street vendors were lighting lanterns beside their stalls, the smell of grilled meat and spices filling the air. Music drifted from open doorways, the distinctive sound of the balafon mixing with modern instruments in the fusion that characterized contemporary Burkinabe culture. For a moment, Traoré allowed himself to appreciate the simple vibrancy of his country, the resilience of people who had endured so much, yet still found reasons to celebrate life. The interrogation facility was located in an older district, housed in a nondescript building that had once served as a colonial administrative center. Traoré entered through a side entrance, avoiding the front desk and the inevitable questions his presence would generate. The first man was waiting in a small interview room, seated at a metal table with his hands folded in front of him. When the door opened and he saw Traoré, his face broke into a wide smile. "Ibrahim, Captain, I knew you would remember me." Traoré studied him carefully, saying nothing. The man appeared to be in his early 40s, with the wiry build of someone who had spent years in military service. His skin bore the deep tan of someone who had campaigned in the northern deserts. There was a scar above his left eyebrow, exactly where Traoré remembered it. "You know why you're here?" Traoré asked, keeping his voice neutral. "Because someone else is claiming to be me," the man replied. "I don't know who he is or what he wants, but I'm the real Moussa Diallo. We served together in Djibo. I was there when you pulled Lieutenant Sawadogo out of that collapsed bunker. I was there when we ran out of ammunition on the 3rd day and had to hold position with nothing but determination and prayer." The details were accurate. Traoré remembered both incidents vividly, but details could be learned, stories could be rehearsed. He needed something more. "Tell me about the night before the main assault," Traoré said, pulling up a chair. "Just you and me. What did we talk about?" The man's smile faded slightly, replaced by a more somber expression. "We talked about home, about what we were fighting for. You told me about your studies in geology, how you wanted to help find water sources for villages in the drought-stricken regions. You said that if we survived, you were going to make sure our soldiers never had to fight with inadequate equipment again." Traoré felt a chill, despite the warmth of the room. Those were indeed the topics they had discussed, private conversations he had never shared with anyone. But the uncomfortable truth was that if someone had interrogated the real Diallo, they could have extracted such information. Intelligence agencies were skilled at making people talk, especially if they had time and motivation. "Wait here," Traoré said, standing abruptly. He found Karim in the observation room. "What do you think?" his assistant asked. "He knows too much to dismiss, but that could mean anything. Where's the other one?" Chapter 2. The second interview room was identical to the first, down to the placement of the furniture and the harsh fluorescent lighting that cast everything in stark, unforgiving clarity. The man seated at the table looked up when Traoré entered, and for a disorienting moment, it was like looking at a mirror image of the person he had just left. This man had the same build, the same weathered complexion, the same scar above his left eyebrow. But where the first man had greeted him with enthusiasm, this one rose slowly, his movements measured and respectful. "Captain President," he said formally, offering a crisp salute despite being in civilian clothes. "Permission to speak freely." The formality struck Traoré as significant. Military protocol had been second nature to all of them, but in the years since the war, many veterans had adopted more casual manners. This adherence to old forms could indicate authenticity or simply good preparation. "Granted. Sit down." Both men sat simultaneously. A strange choreography that felt rehearsed, though Traoré knew it was not. He studied this second man with the same intensity he had applied to the first, searching for anything that might distinguish truth from deception. "You claim to be Moussa Diallo," Traoré began. "I don't claim to be anyone. I am Moussa Diallo. I served under you in the northern campaigns. I was part of the Otapuanu offensive, and I came here because I discovered someone was impersonating me, and I needed to warn you before they could get close enough to cause harm." Warn me about what? About the fact that insurgent intelligence has been systematically identifying veterans from your past campaigns. They're building profiles, gathering information, looking for ways to exploit your known associations. I only found out by accident when a contact in Kaya told me someone was asking questions about me, about my service record, about my relationship with you. Traoré leaned back in his chair. If what you're saying is true, why didn't you go through official channels? Why show up at the presidential compound unannounced? Because I don't know who to trust. If they've managed to create a convincing enough duplicate to fool your security, they might have people on the inside. I needed to reach you directly. The logic was sound, perhaps too sound. It was exactly what Traoré himself would have done in similar circumstances, but that also made it the perfect cover story for someone who had studied him thoroughly. Tell me something only the real Moussa Diallo would know, Traoré said. Something we never wrote down, never reported. The man was quiet for a long moment, his gaze distant as if reaching back through years of memory. When he spoke, his voice was softer, tinged with emotion. 3 nights before the main assault, you couldn't sleep. You came out to the perimeter where I was on watch. We sat together and you told me you were afraid, not of dying, but of leading men to their deaths. You said you felt like an impostor yourself, a geology student playing soldier when real leaders were needed. Traoré felt the words like physical blows. He had said exactly that, had confessed those fears to someone he trusted in a moment of vulnerability he had tried to forget. But the first man had also known details he should not have known. How was he supposed to distinguish between genuine memory and extracted intelligence? That conversation, Traoré said carefully. How many people knew about it? Only you and me. We were alone. You specifically chose that time because the shift change meant there was a gap in the patrol pattern. You wanted privacy. Again, accurate. Traoré had been careful about that conversation, aware that showing doubt could undermine morale. But a skilled interrogator could have gotten these details from the real Diallo, assuming this man was not him. Why did you wait 6 years to contact me? Traoré asked, changing tactics. I didn't wait. I left the military after the war. I moved to Bobo Dioulasso, started a small business transporting goods. I had no reason to think about politics until your coup. When you came to power, I was proud. Proud that someone I served with was trying to change things, but I also knew better than to approach you. You had enough people asking for favors. So why now? Because 3 weeks ago, a man came to my shop asking questions. He said he was doing research for a documentary about the northern campaigns. He had photographs, old military records. He asked specific questions about you, about your habits, your friends. I didn't think much of it until my contact in Kaya called me. That's when I realized this wasn't a documentary. This was reconnaissance. Traoré stood and walked to the small window that looked out onto an interior courtyard. The facility had been built during colonial times, and the architecture still bore traces of that era, a reminder of the foreign powers that had once controlled Burkina Faso. He thought about his own efforts to distance the country from French influence, to build partnerships with other African nations instead. Was this situation connected to those larger geopolitical struggles? Were foreign intelligence services involved, or was this purely a domestic threat? The man asking questions, Traoré said without turning around, did you get a name? He called himself Amidou, but that's probably false. Description? Tall, maybe 185 centimeters, lighter complexion, spoke French with an accent that could have been from anywhere. He knew enough about military matters to ask intelligent questions, but he made mistakes that suggested he'd never actually served. This level of detail was helpful, but also potentially suspicious. If this man was himself the impostor, he would have every reason to provide information that seemed valuable, while actually leading Traoré away from the truth. I need you to stay here tonight, Traoré said finally. Both of you will remain in custody until I can verify which of you is telling the truth. I understand, but Captain, whoever the impostor is, he's good. Very good. He'll have answers for everything. The only way you'll know for sure is by testing knowledge that couldn't have been extracted or researched. That's exactly what I intend to do. Traoré left the room and found Karim waiting in the corridor. Get our best intelligence people on this. I want background checks on both men, deep ones. Financial records, travel history, any associates. Also contact our people in Kaya and Bobo Dioulasso. Verify the stories. That will take time, sir. Then we make time. Meanwhile, I need to think. They drove back to the presidential compound in silence, Traoré's mind working through the puzzle. Two men, identical in their knowledge and their scars. One genuine, one false, but which was which? The compound was quiet when they arrived, most of the staff having gone home for the evening. Traoré dismissed his guards and made his way to his private quarters, a modest suite that he had specifically requested be kept simple. Luxury felt wrong when so many Burkinabés struggled to meet basic needs. He sat at his desk and opened his laptop, accessing the encrypted files that contained his personal records. Somewhere in those documents were details about the Djibo campaign, about the men who served with him, about Moussa Diallo. He read through after-action reports, casualty lists, commendations. Diallo had been mentioned several times, always favorably. A reliable officer, brave under fire, good with logistics. But nothing in these official records would help him now. What he needed were the unofficial memories, the small moments that made up real human connection. He closed his eyes and tried to reconstruct those days in his mind, not as a commander reviewing operations, but as a man remembering friends. Chapter 3. Sleep eluded Traoré that night. He lay in his bed, staring at the ceiling fan that rotated slowly overhead, and wrestled with the implications of what he faced. By morning, he had made a decision. If official verification would take too long and might be compromised anyway, he would have to trust his own judgment. He would conduct a series of tests, questions that only the real Moussa Diallo could answer, based on shared experience rather than documented fact. But even as he formulated this plan, doubt crept in. Memory was fallible. 6 years was a long time. What if the real Diallo had forgotten details that the impostor had learned? What if Traoré's own recollections were inaccurate, shaped by time and trauma into something different from what actually happened? He rose before dawn and dressed in his military uniform, the one he wore for formal occasions. The red beret that had become his signature was carefully positioned, a symbol that connected him to his past as a soldier and his present as a leader. He looked at himself in the mirror and saw the weight of responsibility etched into his features. At 36, he sometimes felt ancient, burdened by decisions that affected millions. The presidential compound was already showing signs of activity when he emerged from his quarters. Gardeners tended the sparse vegetation that grew in the dry soil. Guards changed shifts, and cleaning staff prepared for another day of maintaining the administrative heart of Burkina Faso. It all seemed so normal, so routine, yet Traoré knew that beneath this surface calm, his country remained fragile. One wrong decision, one misplaced trust, could trigger consequences that would ripple through the government and beyond. Karim was waiting for him with a folder of preliminary findings. The initial background checks are complete, sir. They raise more questions than they answer. They walked together toward the secured conference room where Traoré planned to conduct more extensive interviews. Tell me, the first man, the one who greeted you with enthusiasm, has a documented presence in Ouagadougou for the past 3 years. He's been working as a security consultant, which gives him access to various networks and information sources. His financial records show regular income, but nothing suspicious. And the second, more complicated. He does operate a transport business in Bobo Dioulasso, as he claimed, but we found gaps in his documentation. There's a period of about 8 months, 2 years ago, where we can't account for his whereabouts. No financial transactions, no witnesses, nothing. Traoré processed this information. The gaps could be explained innocently, or they could indicate something darker. What about their physical appearances? Any signs of surgery, alterations? Both men were examined by our medical staff last night. No evidence of recent surgical modification. The scars they bear, including the distinctive one above the eyebrow, appear to be old injuries, consistent with the timeline they claim. So someone has either found a perfect doppelganger or has been planning this deception for years. It would seem so, sir. They entered the conference room where Traoré had arranged for more controlled conditions. He wanted both men present for this next phase, wanted to see how they reacted to each other, how they handled direct confrontation. It was a risk, allowing them in the same space, but he needed to observe the dynamics between them. The two men were brought in separately and seated at opposite ends of a long table. Traoré took his position at the head, with Karim and 2 intelligence officers flanking him. The room was windowless, soundproofed. designed for discussions that required absolute privacy. For a long moment, neither of the alleged Moussa Diallos spoke. They regarded each other with expressions that ranged from curiosity to something harder, more dangerous. Traoré let the silence build, watching for tells, for any sign of nervousness or confidence that might reveal the truth. Finally, the first man, the one who had greeted Traoré with familiarity, broke the silence. "This is absurd. Ibrahim, you know me. We've been through too much together for you to doubt who I am." The second man remained quiet, his gaze steady on Traoré. The contrast in their responses was notable, one seeking to appeal to emotion and shared history, the other maintaining discipline and protocol. "I'm going to ask you both a series of questions," Traoré said. "You'll answer them separately in writing without consulting each other. The questions will be about our time in Djibo, but they won't be about major events. They'll be about small details, the kind of thing you wouldn't find in reports or briefings." He distributed paper and pens, then began. "First question, what was the nickname we gave to the cook who prepared our meals during the siege?" Both men bent to their papers. Traoré had chosen this question carefully. The cook had been a civilian contractor, an older woman from a nearby village who had insisted on staying despite the danger. She had a distinctive way of humming while she worked, and the soldiers had affectionately called her Mother Melody. It wasn't something that would appear in any official record. After they finished writing, he collected the papers. The first man had written Mother Melody because she hummed traditional songs. The second man had written Mother Melody, both correct, but one answer was more complete. Traoré made a mental note and continued. "Second question, describe the makeshift shower we constructed behind the command post." Again, they wrote. This time, the answers diverged slightly. The first man described a structure made from scrap metal and canvas, fed by a water tank they had salvaged from a damaged vehicle. The second man provided similar details, but added that they had painted the tank blue and someone had stenciled Paradise Pool on the side as a joke. Traoré remembered that detail. He remembered laughing at the absurdity of calling a rusty tank with cold water a pool, remembered the way it had lifted spirits during the darkest days of the siege. But could that detail have been learned from someone who was there? The questions continued, each one probing deeper into the texture of daily life during that campaign. What song did Lieutenant Sawadogo always sing when he was nervous? Where did they hide their personal items to keep them safe from the dust storms? What was the first thing they ate when supplies finally arrived after the 2-week shortage? Some answers matched perfectly. Others showed variations that could indicate either imperfect memory or imperfect intelligence. Traoré found himself growing increasingly frustrated. These men were either both genuine in their recollections, or one of them had access to information so detailed that it included the minutiae of camp life. After 2 hours, he called for a break. The two alleged Diallos were separated again, returned to their holding areas. Traoré remained in the conference room with Karim and the intelligence officers, spreading out the written answers across the table. "What do you see?" he asked his team. One of the intelligence officers, a woman named Captain Zongo, who had experience in counterintelligence, spoke first. "The first subject is more consistent in his emotional responses. He writes with confidence, doesn't second-guess his answers. The second subject is more measured, more cautious. That could indicate guilt or simply a more careful personality," Karim observed. "True," Captain Zongo agreed. "But there's something else. The first subject uses military terminology more naturally. His descriptions have the structure of someone who's been trained to observe and report. The second subject writes more like a civilian would, even though both supposedly have the same military background." Traoré considered this. After leaving the military, many veterans did adopt more civilian patterns of speech and thought. It was part of the transition back to normal life, but it could also be a sign that someone's military experience was less deeply ingrained. Chapter 4. As afternoon shadows lengthened across Ouagadougou, Traoré made an unscheduled visit to the National Archives, a building that housed decades of military records and documentation. If official reports couldn't definitively answer his questions, perhaps there were other materials that might help: photographs, personal correspondence, anything that could provide additional verification. The head archivist, an elderly man named Monsieur Bonkungu, who had worked there since before independence, greeted Traoré with both surprise and concern. "Captain President, we weren't expecting you. How can we assist?" I need everything you have from the Jibo campaign, specifically the Otapuanu offensive. Every document, every photograph, every scrap of paper that mentions the operation." Bonkungu's eyes widened slightly. "That's a significant amount of material, sir. It may take several hours to compile. I'll wait." While the archivists worked, Traoré found himself drawn to a wall of photographs documenting Burkina Faso's military history. Images of soldiers from different eras, different conflicts, all sharing the same expression of determination mixed with weariness. He wondered how many of these men had faced situations like his, where trust became a weapon that could be turned against them. His phone buzzed. A message from Karim. "Medical forensics completed detailed analysis. Both subjects have identical healed fracture to the left radius, consistent with injury from 6 years ago. This complicates matters further." Traoré stared at the message. How was such precision possible? Had the insurgents, or whoever was behind this, found someone who not only looked like Moussa Diallo, but had suffered the same injuries? Or had they somehow obtained medical records and used them to surgically recreate damage to match? The resources required for such an operation suggested state-level involvement, not just insurgent groups. This realization opened disturbing new possibilities. Which foreign power would benefit from infiltrating his inner circle? The French, angry about being expelled from their former colony, neighboring countries worried about the alliance of Sahel states, or perhaps internal enemies, remnants of the previous government seeking revenge. Monsieur Bonkungu returned with 3 large boxes. "This is everything we have from that period, sir. Some of it has never been fully catalogued." Traoré began working through the materials systematically. After-action reports he had already seen, casualty lists that made his chest tighten with remembered grief, supply requisitions that documented the shameful inadequacy of their equipment, and then buried in the 3rd box, something unexpected. It was a small notebook, its cover stained and worn. The label identified it as belonging to Lieutenant Moussa Diallo. Traoré's hands trembled slightly as he opened it. The pages contained handwritten notes, observations, sketches. Some were clearly military in nature, positions of defensive works, timing of patrols, but others were more personal. Thoughts about the war, about home, about fear and hope. He read through the entries carefully, his heart rate accelerating when he found references to conversations with Captain T himself. Some of these conversations he remembered, others were hazier in his recollection. But what struck him most was the voice in these words. The notebook captured personality in a way that official records never could. There was an entry dated 2 days before the main assault. "Captain T can't sleep. Found him on the perimeter tonight. We talked about fear, about duty. He confessed doubts about his leadership. I told him that doubt is what makes good leaders. Those who are certain of everything make the most dangerous mistakes. I hope he remembers that when this is over. If we survive." Traoré closed his eyes. He did remember that conversation, remembered Diallo's words about doubt and leadership. But had he shared those specific words with anyone else? Could they have been extracted or discovered by someone seeking to impersonate Diallo? He photographed every page of the notebook with his phone, then continued searching. Near the bottom of the 3rd box, he found a collection of personal photographs that had been collected from various soldiers. Among them was one that made him pause, a group shot taken during a brief leave period. Soldiers gathered around a table in what looked like a restaurant in Kaya. He recognized himself, younger and thinner, with the exhaustion of sustained combat evident in his posture. And next to him, unmistakably, was Moussa Diallo. But what caught Traoré's attention was a detail in the background of the photograph. On the wall behind them hung a calendar, and through careful examination, he could make out that it was displaying March of that year. He knew from the official timeline that this would have been during a 10-day period when his unit had rotated back for rest and resupply. The date was significant because it was mentioned in neither man's account of their service. He took the photograph and the notebook, thanked Monsieur Bonkungu, and returned to the presidential compound. The sun was setting, painting the sky in shades of orange and purple that reminded him of the Sahel sunsets he had watched during the campaign, beautiful and harsh like the country itself. Back in the secure conference room, he had both men brought in again. This time, he placed the photograph on the table between them without comment. Both men studied it with obvious recognition. The first leaned forward, a smile crossing his face. I remember this. We were in Kaya. It was the first hot meal we'd had in weeks. The second man nodded slowly. The restaurant owner was a woman named Fatima. She refused to charge us for the food. Said it was her contribution to the defense of Burkina Faso. Both details were correct and could have been remembered by someone who was there. Traoré pointed to the calendar visible in the background. What date was this taken? The first man squinted at the photograph. March 14th or 15th, I think. Somewhere in that range. The second man said simply, March 15th, my sister's birthday. I remember because I called her that evening from a payphone outside the restaurant. Traoré made a note. Your sister's name? Aminata. He turned to the first man. Did Moussa Diallo have a sister named Aminata? The first man hesitated. I'm not certain. We didn't talk much about family. I did, the second man said quietly. I talked about Aminata often. She was studying to be a teacher. I was worried about her because she was in Ouagadougou and there had been some unrest there. This was verifiable information, assuming Moussa Diallo actually had a sister. Traoré made another note. We'll check on that. He then produced the notebook. Both men's eyes widened when they saw it. He opened to a random page and read an entry about a supply mishap that had left their unit without clean water for 3 days. Who remembers this incident? Both men raised their hands. Of course they did. Such details could have been shared among the unit or could have been extracted during interrogation. He tried a different approach. This notebook contains sketches, Traoré said. I'm going to describe one, and I want you each to tell me the story behind it. He had chosen a particular sketch, a simple drawing of a bird perched on what appeared to be a rifle barrel. The bird and the rifle. What's the significance? The first man thought for a moment. It was something you drew, wasn't it? During one of the quiet moments. Traoré shook his head. This notebook belonged to Moussa Diallo. The second man spoke up. I drew that. It was during a ceasefire, one of the temporary truces that never lasted. A bird, some kind of weaver, landed on my rifle while I was on watch. It sat there for 10 minutes, completely unafraid. I sketched it because it seemed important somehow. A reminder that life continued even in the middle of death. The first man's expression shifted slightly, a flicker of uncertainty that Traoré caught. Yes, I remember now. The weaver bird. But the damage was done. The hesitation, the need to be corrected before offering the full memory. These suggested someone working from incomplete information rather than genuine recollection. Traoré continued to probe, using the notebook as a guide. He asked about specific entries, about thoughts and observations that only the person who wrote them would fully understand. The pattern that emerged was subtle but consistent. The second man answered with the confidence of someone accessing his own memories, while the first man showed increasing signs of having to work to reconstruct details. After 3 more hours, Traoré called another break. He was exhausted, his mind struggling to process all the information he had gathered, but he was beginning to form a conclusion, one that felt right in a way that transcended logic or evidence. Chapter 5. That evening, Traoré called a meeting with his closest advisors. In addition to Karim, he summoned Captain Zongo and 2 other senior military officers he had known for years, people whose loyalty he trusted absolutely. They gathered in his private office, away from the official conference rooms and their potential monitoring devices. I believe I know which man is the impostor, Traoré began without preamble. But I need your input before I make a final decision. He laid out everything he had learned, the written answers, the notebook discoveries, the subtle differences in how the 2 men responded to questions. His advisors listened intently, occasionally asking questions or offering observations. Captain Zongo was the first to speak. The evidence suggests the second man is genuine, but evidence can be manufactured. Have we considered the possibility that both men are impostors? The question hung in the air. Traoré had considered it, of course. What if the real Moussa Diallo was dead or imprisoned somewhere, and both of these men were part of an elaborate intelligence operation designed to sow confusion and doubt? If that were the case, Karim said slowly, what would be the purpose? Why send 2 impostors when one would accomplish the same goal? To paralyze us with uncertainty, one of the other officers suggested, to make us question everything, trust no one. Traoré shook his head. That's too complex. Intelligence operations work best when they're simple. One impostor, thoroughly prepared, would be far more effective than this two-man approach. Unless, Captain Zongo said, the goal isn't to deceive you, but to test your judgment, to see if you can still distinguish truth from lies, friend from enemy. The implications of that idea were troubling. If this was a test, who was administering it, and what would happen if he failed? His phone rang. He almost ignored it, but the number was from Bobo Dioulasso, from the contact he had sent to verify the second man's story about the transport business. He answered, "Captain President, I've completed the verification. The business exists exactly as described. More importantly, I found the shop owner's sister, Aminata Diallo. She's a teacher, as claimed. She confirmed that her brother called her on March 15th, 6 years ago from Kaya. She remembered because it was her birthday, and she was surprised to hear from him." Traoré felt something release in his chest. Not definitive proof by itself, but another piece of evidence supporting his growing conviction. "Thank you. Document everything and send me the written report." After he hung up, he shared the information with his advisors. The room fell silent as they processed the implications. "So the second man is likely genuine," Karim said, "which means the first man is either an impostor or—" Captain Zongo trailed off. "Or what?" Traoré prompted. "Or he believes he's telling the truth. It's possible to implant false memories, especially if someone has been subjected to psychological manipulation over an extended period. This opened yet another disturbing possibility. What if the first man was an unwitting participant in his own deception? What if he had been captured, broken, rebuilt with false memories that he genuinely believed were real? We need to know more about his background, Traoré decided. Over the past 3 years in Ouagadougou, every person he's interacted with, every job he's taken, I want to know who he really is. Over the next 2 days, while Traoré continued his interviews, his intelligence team worked around the clock to build a complete picture of the first man's recent history. What they discovered was illuminating. The man calling himself Moussa Diallo had indeed worked as a security consultant, but his client list was interesting. Several were businesses with ties to foreign interests, including French companies that had lost contracts after Traoré's government terminated various agreements. He had traveled extensively, including trips to neighboring countries and to Europe, all supposedly for business purposes. More significantly, they found evidence of contact with known intelligence operatives, emails that had been deleted but recovered from servers, meeting records from hotels, financial transactions that didn't match his claimed income sources. "He's a professional," Captain Zongo concluded after reviewing all the material, "probably recruited and trained specifically for this operation. The question is whether he knows he's an imposter or if he's been psychologically conditioned to believe his own cover story." Traoré studied the surveillance photographs they had collected, images of the first man meeting with various individuals in cafes and offices around Ouagadougou, set up a confrontation. "I want to present him with this evidence and see how he reacts." The final confrontation took place in the secure conference room. Traoré had both men brought in together, with the intelligence evidence arranged on the table. The first man's face went pale when he saw the photographs. "I can explain," he began, but Traoré raised a hand to silence him. "No more lies. I know who you are. The question now is whether you're a willing participant in this deception or a victim of it." The man slumped in his chair, the confident bearing he had maintained for days finally cracking. I remember everything I told you. I remember Jibo, I remember serving with you. But when I see these photographs, I also remember other things. Things that don't fit together. Who recruited you?" Traoré asked, his voice firm but not unkind. If this man was a victim, he deserved a measure of compassion. "I don't know. There are gaps, times I can't account for. I thought I was working as a security consultant, but now I'm not sure what was real and what was—" He pressed his hands to his temples. "They did something to me, didn't they? Planted memories." Captain Zongo leaned forward. "It's possible. There are techniques, drugs that can make people suggestible, that can blur the line between memory and imagination. Combined with detailed briefings and hypnotic suggestion, they can create false recollections that feel entirely real." The second man, the real Moussa Diallo, watched this exchange with a mixture of anger and pity. Who would do this? Who has that kind of capability? "Several intelligence agencies," Traoré said, "and not just foreign ones. There are elements within our own country who would benefit from creating chaos, from undermining trust in my government. He turned back to the first man. What's your real name? I think it's Mark. Mark Ouedraogo. I remember being a soldier, but not in Djibo, somewhere else. And then there's nothing, just darkness. And then I wake up in Ouagadougou with these memories that feel so real. Chapter 6, the revelation that Mark Ouedraogo had been psychologically manipulated changed the nature of the situation. He wasn't simply an enemy agent, but a victim of sophisticated mind control techniques. Traoré ordered him transferred to a medical facility, where specialists could attempt to help him recover his true memories and identity. Meanwhile, the real Moussa Diallo remained in protective custody, though now more as a guest than a suspect. Traoré met with him privately in a comfortable room rather than the harsh interrogation spaces they had been using. "I'm sorry for what you've endured these past days," Traoré said sincerely. "The precautions were necessary, but I know they were difficult." Diallo nodded, his expression showing understanding rather than resentment. "You did what any responsible leader would do. I'm just glad we got to the truth before anything worse happened." They sat in comfortable silence for a moment, the years of separation collapsing as shared memories reasserted themselves. This was indeed his old comrade. Traoré could feel it now with certainty. The way Diallo held himself, the small mannerisms, the fundamental presence of the man, all of it matched what he remembered. "Tell me honestly," Traoré said, "why did you really come here? You could have sent word through official channels about the intelligence threat." Diallo smiled slightly. "Because I wanted to see if you had changed. If power had corrupted you the way it corrupts so many, I needed to know if the man I served with, the one who cared about finding water for villages, was still there beneath the red beret and the title. And what's your conclusion? That you're still fighting the same fight, just on a different battlefield, still trying to make sure our soldiers have what they need, still putting the country before yourself." Traoré appreciated the sentiment, though he wondered if Diallo's assessment was entirely accurate. Power did change people, often in ways they didn't recognize. He had tried to remain true to his principles, but he also knew that governing required compromises that his younger self might have found troubling. "Oh, see, there's something I need you to help me with," Traoré said, shifting to the matter at hand. "Mark Ouedraogo was clearly programmed and planted by someone. We need to find out who and why. Your background in logistics and your civilian business connections might give you a perspective my military intelligence people lack." Diallo considered this. "You want me to investigate? I want you to be part of the investigation. You've been out in the civilian world. You understand how things work outside military and government circles. You might see connections others would miss." Over the next several days, Diallo worked alongside Captain Zongo and the intelligence team. The picture that emerged was troubling. Mark Ouedraogo's transformation from whoever he really was into the false Moussa Diallo had been carried out with extraordinary precision. Medical records showed he had undergone minor cosmetic procedures to match his appearance more closely to Diallo's, including the creation of the distinctive scar. He had been given extensive briefings using what appeared to be information extracted from multiple sources, possibly including captured soldiers who had served in the same units. But who had the resources and motivation to conduct such an operation? The investigation led them through a maze of shell companies, offshore accounts, and encrypted communications. Finally, they found a connection to a private security firm with ties to elements of the previous government, the one Traoré had overthrown in his coup. "It's a revenge operation," Captain Zongo concluded. "Former regime elements working with foreign contractors to destabilize your government. The plan was probably to have the false Diallo gain your trust, get close to you, and then either gather intelligence or wait for the right moment to eliminate you." Traoré absorbed this information with grim acceptance. He had known that his reforms would make enemies, that removing French military presence and nationalizing mining operations would provoke retaliation. But the sophistication of this particular plot suggested resources beyond what he had anticipated. "We need to move against these elements before they try again," Karim urged. But Traoré hesitated. Heavy-handed crackdowns could play into his enemies, narratives about authoritarian rule. He needed to be strategic, to dismantle the network without becoming the dictator they accused him of being. "So we'll share our findings with the public," he decided. "Transparency is our best weapon. If people understand the threats we face, they'll be less likely to believe enemy propaganda. This decision proved controversial among his advisors. Some worried that publicizing the manipulation of Mark Ouedraogo would make the government look vulnerable. Others feared it would spark paranoia and witch hunts. In the end, Traoré followed his instincts. He held a televised address in which he explained what had happened, showing evidence of the conspiracy while being careful not to demonize all political opposition. He spoke about Mark Ouedraogo as a victim rather than a villain, and he emphasized that Burkina Faso's strength lay not in hiding threats, but in facing them together. The response was mixed, but generally positive. Many Burkinabés appreciated the transparency, seeing it as evidence of a different kind of leadership. International observers noted it as an unusual move in a region where governments typically operated with maximum secrecy. If you're enjoying this story, consider subscribing to the channel so we can continue bringing you more content like this. Chapter 7. In the weeks following the resolution of the impostor crisis, Traoré found his relationship with Moussa Diallo evolving in unexpected ways. The investigation into the conspiracy had revealed gaps in his government's intelligence capabilities, weaknesses that needed to be addressed. Diallo, with his unique combination of military experience and civilian business acumen, became an informal advisor. They would meet in the evenings, after official business concluded, sometimes in Traoré's office but often in more casual settings around Ouagadougou. They visited tea shops where locals gathered, walking through markets where vendors sold everything from traditional textiles to imported electronics. These excursions served multiple purposes. They allowed Traoré to stay connected with ordinary citizens. They provided opportunities for private conversations away from palace intrigue, and they reminded him why he was fighting to improve the country. One evening, as they sat in a small café near the Grand Market, Diallo raised a sensitive topic. "You know that solving this one conspiracy doesn't mean you're safe. There will be others. The forces arrayed against your government are significant." Traoré nodded, sipping his tea. "I'm aware, but I can't govern from a position of paranoia. Trust has to be balanced with vigilance." "Speaking of trust," Diallo continued carefully, "there's something I think you need to hear. The people love you right now, but love is fragile. Every decision you make that centralizes power, every delay in returning to democratic rule, every restriction on the press, these things erode trust incrementally." It was a bold statement, the kind that could be seen as criticism of the military government Traoré led. But it was also exactly why Traoré valued Diallo's counsel. Too many of his advisors told him what they thought he wanted to hear. "How you think I'm becoming what I opposed?" Traoré asked, not defensively but genuinely curious. "I think you're facing impossible choices. Security requires control, but control can become oppression. Development requires time, but people are impatient. Change requires breaking old systems, but chaos can follow when you break things too quickly." Diallo leaned back in his chair. "I don't envy you. But I also think you need people who will tell you when you're making mistakes." "And am I making mistakes?" "Some. The restrictions on journalists who criticize your policies, for example. I understand the need to combat foreign propaganda, but silencing domestic critics makes you look weak, not strong. It suggests you can't defend your policies on their merits." Traoré considered this. He had indeed authorized actions against media outlets that he viewed as destabilizing. But Diallo's point struck home. True strength meant tolerating criticism, engaging with it rather than suppressing it. "I'll think about that," he said finally. Their conversation was interrupted by a commotion outside the café. Raised voices, the sound of vehicles approaching quickly. Traoré's security detail, which had been discreetly positioned around the area, suddenly became very visible. Karim appeared at the café entrance, his expression tense. "Sir, we need to leave, now." Traoré and Diallo followed without question, moving swiftly to the armored vehicle that had pulled up to the curb. As they drove away, Karim explained that intelligence had picked up chatter about a possible attack being planned for that evening. The café they had been in was mentioned specifically. "How did they know we'd be there?" Traoré demanded. "Unknown, sir. Either sophisticated surveillance or someone in our inner circle is compromised." The implications were chilling. If the impostor conspiracy had taught them anything, it was that their security had vulnerabilities. But the idea that someone currently serving in his government might be actively working against him was even more troubling. Back at the presidential compound, emergency protocols were implemented. All non-essential personnel were sent home. Those who remained were subjected to enhanced security screening. Traoré convened his Security Council to assess the threat. "We can't keep reacting to threats," he told them. "We need to be proactive. I want a comprehensive review of everyone with access to my schedule, my movements, my decisions, and I want it done by people from outside the current structure." Captain Zongo volunteered to lead the investigation, working with Diallo and a team of carefully vetted personnel. What they uncovered over the next week was both expected and surprising. There was no single mole passing information to enemy groups. Instead, they found a more insidious problem. Loose operational security had allowed patterns to become predictable. Traoré's preference for informal meetings in public places, while politically valuable for showing connection with ordinary citizens, had made him vulnerable. His schedule, while officially classified, could be partially reconstructed by anyone paying attention to when and where he appeared. The cafe visit had been guessed at rather than directly leaked, but the result was the same. His enemies had known where to strike. "You need to vary your routines more," Diallo advised. "I know you want to remain accessible, but unpredictability has to be part of your security strategy." Traoré grudgingly accepted this reality. He implemented new protocols, randomizing his movements, using decoy vehicles, limiting the number of people who knew his real schedule. It felt like a retreat from the transparency he valued, but he couldn't serve his country if he was dead. The investigation also revealed something unexpected. Mark Ouedraogo, the man who had been programmed to impersonate Diallo, was making remarkable progress in recovering his true memories. The specialists treating him had used a combination of therapy and medication to help him distinguish between implanted false memories and genuine recollections. Traoré visited him at the medical facility. Mark was sitting in a garden courtyard, looking healthier than he had during the interrogations. His face, which bore surgical alterations to make him resemble Diallo, now seemed somehow different, not in its physical features, but in its expression. "Captain President," Mark said, standing respectfully, "how are you feeling?" "Better. The doctors say I'll never fully recover all my memories, but I know who I am now. I know what was done to me." His voice carried a mixture of anger and sadness. "Will you tell me?" Traoré asked gently. Mark nodded, and they sat together on a bench beneath a tree. "My real name is Mark Ouedraogo, as I said. I was a soldier, but not in your unit. I served in a different region. Nothing distinguished about my service. After I left the military, I struggled to find work. That's when they approached me, men who said they had consulting jobs and good money. Who were they? I never knew their real names, but they were professional, well-funded. They said I'd be helping with security assessments, background investigations. The work seemed legitimate at first. Then they asked me to undergo some medical procedures. They said it was to improve my fitness, to make me more effective in the field." Traoré listened as Mark described a gradual process of manipulation that had culminated in intensive psychological programming. He had been drugged, subjected to what sounded like sophisticated hypnotic techniques, fed false memories through repeated sessions that blurred the line between suggestion and reality. Depict, Chapter 8. As Mark recounted his experience, a disturbing picture emerged of an operation that had taken months to execute. The people behind it had used a combination of chemical manipulation, psychological conditioning, and extensive research to create what they believed would be the perfect infiltration asset. "They showed me photographs of you, of Jibo, of the men who served there," Mark continued. "Hours and hours of images, until I could close my eyes and see them clearly. Then they would describe scenarios, conversations, events. They used something they called memory anchoring, attaching emotional responses to false narratives so they felt like real experiences." "Did they tell you what your ultimate mission was?" Traoré asked. "Not explicitly, but I gathered I was supposed to get close to you, gain your trust. There were coded phrases they taught me, triggers that would activate certain responses. I think they were planning to use me for something specific when the time was right. Do you remember these trigger phrases?" Mark's face darkened. "Some of them. The doctors are helping me identify and neutralize them so they can't be used again. But it's frightening, knowing that parts of my mind were programmed like software." Traoré felt a surge of anger at the people who had done this. Mark Ouedraogo had been turned into a weapon without his informed consent, his autonomy violated in the most fundamental way. It was a violation that went beyond simple espionage. "Will you help us?" Traoré asked. "Help us identify the people who did this to you." "I want to, but my memories of them are fragmentary." They were careful to keep their identities hidden. "Whatever you can provide will be valuable. And Mark, I want you to know that you're not responsible for what was done to you. You're a victim in this." Mark's eyes glistened with emotion. "Thank you for that. It helps to hear it from you." Over the following days, Mark worked with investigators to piece together what he could remember. Despite the fragmentary nature of his recollections, he provided useful intelligence, descriptions of facilities where he had been held, details about the medical procedures, fragments of overheard conversations that suggested the conspiracy reached into Burkina Faso's neighboring countries and beyond. The investigation led Captain Zongo and her team to a series of linked operations. It became clear that the plot to infiltrate Traoré's inner circle was just one part of a larger destabilization campaign. Other elements included economic sabotage, attempts to foment ethnic tensions, and efforts to undermine Burkina Faso's relationships with its allies in the alliance of Sahel states. "It's a multi-vector attack," Diallo observed as they reviewed the intelligence reports. "They're trying to hit you from every angle, politically, economically, militarily, and personally, which suggests significant resources." Traoré added, "This isn't just remnants of the previous government, they're getting support from somewhere." The answer came from an unexpected source. One of Burkina Faso's diplomats stationed in Paris sent an encrypted communication reporting that he had uncovered evidence of French intelligence involvement in coordinating various anti-Traoré operations. The revelation wasn't entirely surprising. France had made no secret of its displeasure with being expelled from its former colony, but having confirmation was significant. "What do we do with this information?" Karim asked during a Security Council meeting. Traoré considered carefully. Accusing France directly could escalate tensions in ways that would harm Burkina Faso's interests, but ignoring the evidence would signal weakness. "We document everything meticulously," he decided. "We build an unassailable case, and then we take it to the African Union and other international bodies. We expose what's being done to us in a way that makes it impossible for them to deny or dismiss." This approach required patience and precision, qualities that Traoré had learned during his military service. You didn't charge blindly into battle. You gathered intelligence, prepared your position, and struck when you had maximum advantage. Meanwhile, the internal security review continued to reveal vulnerabilities. Some were procedural: inadequate vetting of contractors, poor control of classified information. Others were structural: ministerial fiefdoms that operated with insufficient oversight, patronage networks that prioritized loyalty over competence. Traoré knew that addressing these issues would require comprehensive reform, the kind of systemic change that could take years. But he also knew he couldn't wait years. The threats were immediate and evolving. "We need to build a new intelligence service," he told his inner circle, "one that's accountable, professional, and focused on actual threats rather than political games. We need to recruit people who understand that security and liberty aren't opposites but complementary." Moussa Diallo, who had been listening to these discussions, offered a perspective that surprised others in the room. "You might want to consider involving civil society in oversight of this new service. Create mechanisms that allow independent monitoring of intelligence activities." Several of the military officers bristled at this suggestion. The idea of civilian oversight of security operations struck them as dangerous naivete, but Traoré recognized the wisdom in it. "Diallo is right," he said. "One of the reasons the old system failed is because it operated in darkness with no accountability. If we want something better, we have to build it differently." This decision marked a significant evolution in Traoré's thinking. He had come to power through military force, and his government remained dominated by military personnel. But he was beginning to see that sustainable change required broader participation, that the transition he kept promising to civilian rule needed to be more than empty rhetoric. Over the next weeks, working groups were established to design the new intelligence framework. They included military experts, yes, but also academics, civil society representatives, and international consultants with experience in democratic governance of security services. The process was messy and contentious, with fierce debates about where to draw lines between necessary secrecy and public accountability. Traoré participated in many of these discussions personally, not just as the final decision-maker, but as an active contributor to the debate. He found the experience both frustrating and energizing. Frustrating because consensus was hard to achieve and progress felt slow. Energizing because he was engaging with smart, passionate people who cared deeply about Burkina Faso's future. During one particularly contentious session, a civil society representative named Salimata Kone challenged him directly. "Captain President, you say you want accountability, but your government continues to detain journalists without transparent legal process. How can we trust that this new intelligence service will be any different?" The room fell silent. This was the kind of confrontation that in many countries would result in severe consequences for the person asking. But Traoré had specifically encouraged frank dialogue. "You're right to raise that concern," he said after a moment. "Some of the actions we've taken against journalists were justified by immediate security threats. Others, in hindsight, were mistakes driven by frustration with unfair criticism. We need to do better. Will you release the detained journalists?" Salimata pressed. "I'll review each case personally. Those held for legitimate security reasons will remain in custody, but with improved conditions and clearer legal processes. Those held simply for criticism will be released. And will establish clearer guidelines for future cases." This commitment, made publicly in front of witnesses, created accountability that Traoré couldn't easily walk back from. In the days that followed, he did indeed review the cases of detained journalists. It was uncomfortable work, forcing him to confront the ways that his government had sometimes conflated legitimate criticism with hostile propaganda. Several journalists were released with apologies. Others remained detained but were brought before judges and given proper legal representation. The process wasn't perfect, but it represented a meaningful step toward the kind of governance Traoré aspired to create. Moussa Diallo watched these developments with approval. "You're learning," he told Traoré during one of their evening conversations. "Leadership isn't about having all the answers. It's about being willing to question yourself and change course when necessary." Chapter 9. The investigation into the conspiracy against Traoré reached a critical point when they identified one of the key coordinators, a former military officer named Colonel Etienne Caboret, who had fled to Côte d'Ivoire after the coup. Caboret had connections to both the previous government and French intelligence networks, making him the perfect liaison for coordinating destabilization operations. "We have enough evidence to request his extradition," Captain Zongo reported, "but Côte d'Ivoire is unlikely to cooperate. They've been skeptical of your government since the coup." "Then we'll need to approach this differently," Traoré said. "Diplomacy rather than legal demands." He tasked his foreign minister with opening a dialogue with Ivorian authorities, not about extradition, but about shared security concerns. The argument was straightforward. Instability in Burkina Faso threatened the entire region, and elements operating from Ivorian territory were contributing to that instability. While these diplomatic efforts proceeded slowly, Traoré focused on consolidating support domestically. The revelations about the impostor conspiracy and the broader destabilization campaign had sparked public discussion about external threats to Burkina Faso's sovereignty. Traoré channeled this energy into renewed focus on his government's core objectives: improving security, developing the economy, and reducing dependence on foreign powers. One of his most significant initiatives was the expansion of the national gold refinery that had recently become operational. By processing gold domestically rather than exporting it in raw form, Burkina Faso could capture more value from its mineral wealth. The refinery had been controversial, with international mining companies objecting to the changes in regulations, but it was beginning to show economic benefits. Traoré visited the refinery for a public event, celebrating its first major production milestone. He brought Moussa Diallo with him, wanting his old friend to see this tangible example of the changes being implemented. "This is impressive," Diallo said as they toured the facility. "But are you sure you can manage this kind of industrial operation effectively? State-owned enterprises don't have a great track record in Africa, which is why we're doing it differently," Traoré explained. "The refinery operates with significant autonomy, professional management, and regular audits. We're trying to avoid the corruption and inefficiency that plagued previous state projects." The facility manager, a Burkinabe engineer named Dr. Amidou Sawadogo, who had studied abroad but returned to contribute to his country's development, walked them through the processes. As we're currently processing about 50 tons per month, but we have capacity to reach the full 150 tons as operations scale up. And you're finding markets for the refined gold? Diallo asked. Yes, we've established relationships with buyers in several countries, including some who are happy to purchase from us rather than going through European intermediaries. It's been a learning process, but the economics work. This kind of economic independence was central to Traoré's vision for Burkina Faso. For too long, the country had exported raw materials and imported finished goods, a colonial pattern that kept it poor despite abundant natural resources. Changing that pattern required infrastructure, expertise, and the political will to resist pressure from foreign interests. As they left the refinery, Traoré's motorcade took a route through several neighborhoods in Ouagadougou. He had requested this deviation from the security team's preferred path because he wanted to see how ordinary people were living, not just the sanitized views he got on official tours. What he saw was a mixture of hope and hardship. New construction projects indicated economic activity and confidence in the future. But there were also signs of strain: overcrowded housing, inadequate sanitation, the kinds of infrastructure deficits that development couldn't solve overnight. At one point, the motorcade slowed in traffic, and Traoré found himself making eye contact with a woman carrying a child on her back while balancing a basin of goods on her head. The woman's face showed the kind of exhausted determination he had seen countless times, people working incredibly hard just to survive. That image stayed with him for the rest of the day. We're not moving fast enough, he told Diallo that evening. All these projects, all this planning, it's necessary, but people are struggling now. They need to see improvements in their daily lives, not just promises about the future. Development takes time, Diallo reminded him. You've only been in power for a little over 2 years. Some of the problems you're trying to solve have been building for decades. I know. But time is a luxury when people are hungry, when children die from preventable diseases, when young people see no future here and risk everything trying to reach Europe. They were sitting in Traoré's private quarters, a simple space that reflected his personal austerity. Diallo looked around at the modest furnishings, the lack of luxury goods. You could make your life easier, you know, he said. Thus a little more comfort wouldn't compromise your principles. Traoré shook his head. How can I justify luxury when the woman I saw today lives in poverty? Every franc spent on my comfort is a franc not spent on development. That's admirable, but you also need to maintain your health and effectiveness. Grinding yourself down doesn't help anyone. It was gentle criticism, the kind that only real friends could offer. Traoré appreciated it, even as he struggled to accept it. He had driven himself relentlessly since taking power, working long hours, taking minimal time for rest or recreation. The stress was accumulating, though he tried not to show it. The conversation was interrupted by an urgent call from Karim. There had been a terrorist attack in the northern town of Dori. Insurgents had struck a military outpost, killing several soldiers and civilians. Traoré's jaw tightened as he received the details. I need to go there, he told Diallo after hanging up. Your security team won't like that. Dori is in a high-risk zone, which is exactly why I need to go. The soldiers there need to know their commander hasn't forgotten them, that we're not abandoning the north while we focus on politics in the capital. The next morning, despite strong objections from his security detail, Traoré flew to Dori. The town showed the scars of ongoing conflict, damaged buildings, security checkpoints, the tense atmosphere of a place under siege. He visited the military base, spoke with the soldiers, and met with local leaders. Chapter 10. The visit to Dori reinforced for Traoré the fundamental challenge his government faced. Political and economic reforms meant little if people didn't feel safe in their own communities. The insurgency that had been plaguing the Sahel region for years showed no signs of diminishing, despite military operations and international cooperation. At the military base, he gathered the officers for a frank discussion. Tell me honestly, what do you need? Not just equipment, though I know that remains a problem. What would make a real difference in how you operate here? The responses were revealing. Better intelligence about insurgent movements, more cooperation from local communities who were often caught between the military and insurgents, faster response times when attacks occurred, medical facilities adequate to treat casualties, basic quality of life improvements that would make extended deployments more bearable. Traoré took careful notes, asking questions, pushing for specifics. This was the kind of ground-level understanding he valued, the insights that only came from talking directly to people on the front lines. One young lieutenant raised a particularly important point. "Sir, we can kill insurgents all day, but if we don't address why people join them in the first place, we'll never win. They recruit from communities that feel abandoned, that have no economic opportunities, that see the government as distant and corrupt." "So what's the solution?" Traoré asked. "Development has to go hand in hand with security. We need roads, schools, clinics. We need government services that actually work. We need to show people that their future is with us, not with extremists promising paradise." This integrated approach to counterinsurgency was something Traoré understood intellectually, but hearing it articulated by a young officer fighting on the front lines gave it new urgency. Military operations alone would never solve the problem. They needed a comprehensive strategy that addressed root causes. During his visit, Traoré also met with civilian leaders from Dori and surrounding areas. They spoke about the impossible position they were in, pressured by insurgents to provide support, suspected by the military of collaboration, caught in the middle of a conflict they hadn't chosen. "We're patriots," one village chief told him. "We love Burkina Faso, but we also need to protect our families. When men with guns come to our village and demand food or information, what choice do we have? And then when soldiers come and accuse us of helping terrorists, where does that leave us?" Traoré acknowledged the terrible dilemma. What if we could provide better security, military presence that actually protects rather than just conducting raids? That would help. But we also need the basics. Water, healthcare, schools for our children. The insurgents promise these things. They lie, of course, but people are desperate enough to believe them. These conversations confirmed what the young lieutenant had said. Security and development weren't separate issues, but two sides of the same challenge. Traoré returned to Ouagadougou determined to implement a more integrated approach. He convened a special task force that brought together military commanders, development experts, and local government officials. "I want a comprehensive plan for the northern regions," he told them. "Military operations, yes, but also infrastructure development, improved governance, economic opportunities. And I want it implemented in a coordinated way, not as separate initiatives that don't talk to each other." The task force worked intensively for 3 weeks, producing a detailed strategy that Traoré reviewed carefully. It was ambitious, perhaps too ambitious given budgetary constraints, but he was determined to try. Implementation began with 3 pilot districts in the north. Military operations focused on protecting populations, rather than just hunting insurgents. Development projects were accelerated, with special emphasis on water, health, and education. Local government officials received additional training and resources. Civil society organizations were engaged to help build bridges between communities and authorities. The results were mixed but encouraging. In areas where the integrated approach was implemented well, there were signs of improvement. Reduced violence, better cooperation from locals, some economic activity returning. In other areas, persistent challenges and occasional setbacks reminded everyone that there were no easy solutions. Meanwhile, the diplomatic efforts to address external threats continued. The evidence against Colonel Kaboré and his network was presented to international bodies, including the African Union. While some countries remained skeptical of Burkina Faso's military government, the documentation was thorough enough to prompt serious discussion. Then came a breakthrough. Ivorian authorities, facing their own security challenges and increasingly concerned about regional instability, agreed to investigate the activities of Burkinabe exiles operating from their territory. While they didn't extradite Kaboré, they did restrict his movements and freeze accounts linked to the conspiracy. "It's not perfect, but it's progress," Karim reported. "We've disrupted their operations significantly." Traoré nodded, but his attention was already shifting to the next challenge. The national consultations about the transition to civilian rule were approaching. He had promised, when taking power, that the military government would be temporary, that democracy would be restored. But he had also extended the transition timeline. arguing that security and stability needed to be established first. This decision had been controversial. Supporters argued that rushing to elections in the midst of an insurgency would be reckless. Critics charged that it was the classic dictator's excuse for clinging to power. Traoré knew that his legacy would depend significantly on how he handled this transition. He sought Moussa Diallo's advice, valuing his friend's perspective as someone outside the formal government structure. They met at Diallo's modest home in a middle-class neighborhood of Ouagadougou, away from the palace and its constant surveillance. "Tell me honestly," Traoré said, "do you think I should move faster toward elections?" Diallo considered the question carefully. "I think you should be honest with yourself about your motivations. Are you delaying because the country genuinely needs more time to stabilize, or because you're afraid of losing power and seeing your reforms reversed?" The blunt question hit home. Traoré had asked himself the same thing many times. Both, probably. "I do believe we need more time. But I also know that another year or two could make a real difference in what we're able to accomplish." "And what happens if you lose an election? Would you accept that result?" "I would. I have to, or everything I've said about democracy becomes meaningless." "Then maybe the answer is to accelerate certain reforms while also preparing for the transition. Create institutions strong enough to survive regardless of who leads the government. Build systems, not just policies that depend on your personal authority." This wisdom guided Traoré's thinking as he prepared for the national consultations. He would propose a timeline for elections, not immediately but not indefinitely delayed either. 2 years to continue stabilizing security and implementing core reforms. Then free and fair elections, with international observers and guarantees that the military would respect the results. The consultations themselves were complex affairs, bringing together diverse stakeholders with often competing interests. Political parties wanted immediate elections. Civil society groups emphasized the need for comprehensive reforms before any vote. Traditional leaders focused on local governance issues. Business interests wanted economic stability. Traoré listened more than he spoke during the consultations, a deliberate choice that surprised some observers. He was trying to understand what different constituencies truly needed, not just what they said they wanted. The picture that emerged was nuanced. People were genuinely concerned about both security and democracy, about both change and stability,